Hello and welcome to Bible Geeks Week 2, Video 2 on Why Did Jesus Live, Teach, and Heal? Again, this is the Bible study series going in parallel with the sermon series at the First Presbyterian Church of River Forest in the winter of 2018. This is the second video for this week. We're talking about why did Jesus live, and in particular his teaching and healing ministries. The previous video was on the teachings, and this one here is going to be on the healings. There's just a lot of content, and so we're looking at these individually. So the topics that we covered in the previous video, the Sermon on the Mount and the parables, as an overview of Jesus' teaching. The idea there was that Jesus' teaching ministry was about describing the way that God's kingdom was being inaugurated into the world. And if you remember, I talked about this as the teachings and the healings as sort of a left brain and right brain way of communicating the coming kingdom of God. So if the teachings were the logical and sort of explicit way, even though as we described in the parables, they're rich with information but not always explicit, the healings are the experiential way. They're the way that God's kingdom is seen in the way that it's working out. And so actually, this is incorrect, the slide right here. The cleansing of the demoniac and the healing of the paralytic are indeed two healings that we're going to cover. The first one, though, that we're going to cover is the cleansing of the leper in Mark chapter 1. So we're going to talk about three healings, and we're going to be going through the stories that, or what we can learn from those healings. So my thesis here, there we go, is that Jesus' healings have implications for his new covenant ministry. They demonstrate the coming of the kingdom of God in a symbolic and experiential sense, the same way that his teaching does so in a logical and propositional sense. So in other words, his healings aren't just healings. It's not just, as I described in the first video, good guy Jesus, who, because he sees some people in need and he happens to be a good guy, he decided to heal them. After all, he's all powerful. His healings, each one of them, speaks to his ministry, and there's only a few. I mean, I could rattle off a couple right here that, like, the people who want their eyes opened. Come on. Like, this isn't just about healing people, healing the blind. These are people who, since Isaiah have been, said, say to these people, be hearing but not understanding, see but never perceiving. Dull the minds of these people, close their eyes, and then Jesus is opening them. In the context, redemptive historically, it's incredible. But what we're going to talk about here is these three healings: the leper in Mark chapter 1, the demoniac in Mark 4, and the paralytic in John 5. We're going to illustrate some, I think, profound illustrations of, we're going to illustrate some illustrations, good going. We're going to give some profound illustrations of the coming of the kingdom of God in Jesus' ministry here. If you give me 1 second, I'm going to see if I can do anything about the lighting here, because this is a little like Are You Afraid of the Dark going on right now. Okay. Yeah, that's a little bit better there. Not quite getting the fade out on the camera. Give me 1 second. Let's amp that up. You know what? Hold on. There we go. My schma poster back there messes up the camera blur. So, okay. So those are the things we're going to talk about. I'm going to start with the leper in Mark chapter 1. So if you're following along, Mark 1, 40 through 45. So then a man with a serious skin disease came to him, that's Jesus, and on his knees begged him, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." Moved with compassion, Jesus reached out his hand and touched him. "I am willing," Jesus told him, "be made clean." Immediately the disease left him, and he was healed. Then Jesus sternly warned the man and sent him away at once, telling him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go and show yourself to the priest and offer what Moses prescribed for your cleansing as a testimony to them." Yet he went out and began to proclaim it widely and spread the news, with the result that Jesus could no longer enter a town openly, but he was out in deserted places, and they would come to him from everywhere. Okay, so what's going on here? Cleansing the leper in Mark 1, 40 through 45. Let's start with, set the scene here. So the serious skin disease. This is not necessarily Hansen's disease as we know it. When we talk about lepers, there's often this, illustration of, the flesh literally falling off the bones and, the white necrotizing skin and everything. And, yeah, that was considered among the skin diseases. But notice, this is, if I can plug, for a brief moment, my Holman translation here. I really like the way that they handle a lot of these things where there's some ambiguity. The Holman translation that I use says serious skin disease. Leprosy tends to have the connotation of Hansen's disease. This is saying it's a serious skin disease. That's probably the right way to look at this. Any serious skin disease could honestly have been a bad case of psoriasis. But regardless, though, and this is what matters for the story, he has this serious skin disease. So he's isolated from his community because he was unclean. Skin diseases make one unclean. Leviticus 13 goes into excruciating detail about the variety of skin diseases and what to do with them. And then he says, if you're willing, you can make me clean. So let's understand this. What's being asked of Jesus here? Clean, yes, sure, in terms of the disease, but he was ceremonially unclean. The choice of word is important. Clean versus unclean represents not just his physical condition, but his ability to approach the temple and worship Yahweh. This is something that can fly over our heads if we're not looking at it. You can make me clean necessitated the healing of the disease, but the healing of the disease was not the only thing that would make one clean. You had to be declared clean by a priest. Oh, what's going on here? All right. So this is not just about his physical condition. This is about his spiritual condition as well, his ability to approach the temple. So how did people with skin diseases become clean in the Israelite religion? They were to see a priest at the temple who could evaluate you for cleanness and uncleanness. You may need to go through a waiting period. They would inspect you. They would say, no, you're not clean. You need to go wait. There would be ritual washings. And then any contact with another person or thing from you, the person with the skin condition, would render that thing unclean. You exuded uncleanness. Okay, you had to go around, make sure you didn't come into contact with anybody else because you were unclean, and the unclean thing defiles the clean. There's only one place it worked the other way around, and we'll get to that. So yeah, cleanness was a one-way street. Unclean things make clean things unclean, not the other way around, except the priest at the temple, who can impart cleanness to the unclean. So the temple, the place where the glory of God dwelled prior to its departure before the exile, but the Holy of Holies, the priest at the temple, that was the place where you could come as someone unclean and be made clean. So this is how things were done in the Israelite religion. It's very interesting that the leper approaches Jesus and says, if you're willing, you can make me clean. So let's look at that statement. Jesus is being acknowledged as carrying both the office of priest and the power to cleanse the unclean found at the temple. There's so much loaded into that statement with, if you're willing, you can make me clean. It's not just, if you're willing, you can heal me. That's true. But he's also talking about his cleanliness, his spiritual condition. Jesus then is both priest and temple. This is, what we talked about last week during Jesus' baptism and his transfiguration. He is the office of priest to declare somebody clean, but he can also cleanse the disease. He can also say something like, be made clean, and it happens. So there's a tremendous amount of symbolism going on here. Oops. Okay, that was backwards. Then Jesus stretched out his hand. Question here, did Jesus need to do that? Did Jesus need to stretch out his hand? So, we think about, he said, if you're willing, you can make me clean. Moved with compassion, Jesus stretched out his hand. What do we think when we think back to some of Jesus' other healings? Excuse me, if you hadn't watched the other video, I'm getting over a sinus infection. Here's one other example from the Gospel of Matthew. Lord, the centurion replied, I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof, but only say the word and my servant will be cured. Then Jesus told the centurion, go, as you have believed, let it be done for you. And his servant was cured that very moment. You think also to the woman with the flow of blood who came and touched Jesus' robe, and he's like, I felt something go out of me, some power go out of me, and who touched me. And that woman was cleaned just by merely touching Jesus' robe. He didn't need to stretch out his hand. So what's he doing? Why is he stretching out his hand here? Perhaps, here's one way of looking at it. I don't think this is wrong. Perhaps it's because the leper here had been cut off from his people. And so Jesus is being compassionate, welcoming him back. He's been completely unable to have human-to-human contact as somebody who's unclean. And so this is somebody who Jesus is welcoming back in this way. We'd be remiss to stop the analysis there. And this is, I thought of this as I was looking at this passage, this general principle that I wanted to state. Just because we have an explanation doesn't mean we've exhausted the explanation. Oftentimes in interpretation, if we find an explanation, we'll be like, cool, that's it. We've got it, we can move on. I don't think that's a fair or proper way to read the passage. It's not like you can go through all possible explanations, but just because you have one explanation doesn't mean you're there. Especially for something that's as rich as the Gospels, especially for something that has so much meaning as the parables do. You're not done after your first cut at it. And it's also one of the things that makes studying Scripture so enjoyable, right? Because you can keep going back to it and keep seeing different things. So, let's think about this. This is just a question that you can ask yourself whenever as an interpretive question. Where else do you see blank elsewhere in the Bible? Particularly in the New Testament, because it builds so much in the Old Testament. So where else do you see the stretching out of hands in the Bible? Exodus chapter 8, Aaron stretched out his hand, and the frogs came. Exodus chapter 8 again, Aaron stretched out his hand, and the gnats came. Exodus chapter 10, Moses stretched out his hand, and the darkness came. Exodus chapter 14, Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord parted the waters and closed the sea back up, in verses 21 and 27 respectively. In Exodus 9:23 and 10:13, Moses is stretching out his staff, it's obviously attached to his hand, and you see lightning and wind sent from the Lord. There's a lot of stretching out of hands in the Exodus narrative. The stretching out of the hand in the Exodus was the demonstration of the power of Yahweh being invoked. And it appears to be functioning similarly here in the new Exodus. That stretching out of Jesus' hand is a detail that's included to show, like with Moses and Aaron, the power of God being at display. There's another one that I suppose I could have added in here, though I think the parallel is a little bit more tenuous. And Moses first asked to show his hand. He shows his hand, he puts his hand in his robe and he pulls it out and it's withered. And then he puts it back in and it's cleansed. Power of Yahweh, you have the leper here, you have the stretching out of hands. We've already talked a lot about New Moses. I could see a parallel there. I don't think it's as strong as these, personally. But what I will say is that, here, the power of God is being illustrated. Jesus commanding the power of God himself, because he is God. Very much the way that Yahweh's power is being demonstrated. Because that was the whole point of these plagues in Egypt, right? Yahweh demonstrating his power. That's happening here in the new Exodus. Now you see both Moses and Aaron here. One thing, what office did Aaron hold? Obviously, Aaron held the office of priest. He's stretching out his hand and saying, be made clean. The power of Yahweh coming from Jesus' person. The presence of God that can make the unclean clean, as opposed to the other way around, being demonstrated in this story. I think that's so cool. By the way, there's a quick side note I want to include here on Mark 1:41. So moved with compassion. Now you might see in a footnote on your Bible. My Holman does not have that here, but I've seen this in others. That compassion, I think you see that most often in English translations. Some of them, though, will have different readings. Sadly, sad face here, the NIV in the 2011, last I checked at least, has adopted the phrasing Jesus was indignant to describe his behavior towards the leper. Others may describe it as angry either in the footnote or the body of the text. So you got to wonder, what's going on here? How are we not sure about Jesus' attitude? Is Jesus angry or compassionate? It doesn't seem like we should be confusing this one. And then to have some of them put it in a footnote, some of them put it in the body, disagreements about what the word is, what's Jesus' disposition. Then many people are like, well, I mean, he's obviously compassionate, he's healing somebody, but you have a lot of text critics that make the opposite argument. Then indeed, because people are predisposed to think of Jesus as being compassionate here, that would have been the more likely change in the text. So it's based on a textual variant. So orgistheis versus splagnestheis. Orgistheis being angry, splagnestheis being compassionate, that occurs at this point in the manuscript tradition. Without getting too much into it, both of these have early attestation. You find orgistheis and splagnestheis early in the manuscript traditions, so you can't make a historical argument one appeared before the other. They both do make sense in context. These are, parts of speech that form sentences that can be understood. And it's one thing to say that we have to explain Jesus' emotion. That's an interpretive question. A textual question doesn't make sense in context. If it said, moved with giraffe, Jesus reached out his hand, it would clearly not make sense in context. That's not a sentence. That it would just be completely out of the blue. At least having some kind of emotion here in both cases makes it make sense in context. So they're both early, they both make sense in context. Splagnestheis is by far the more attested reading in the tradition. But this is, if you're not familiar with text criticism, this is where an argument comes in. It's known as lectio difficilior. This would be, to translate that, the difficult reading. And the idea is that when you're faced with a situation like this, where you don't know which one was earlier than the other, which one would make more sense than the other, if they both kind of meet on that level, then the argument should be based on this. Obviously, there was a change in the text at some point from the first word that was written. Is it more likely that it would be... the principle goes, it is more likely that it would be changed from a difficult reading to an easy reading than an easy reading to a difficult reading. So, in this case, people would say, because we think of Jesus as a good guy, you're more likely to see somebody change it from Jesus was angry to compassionate, because that just makes sense with our conception of Jesus, than compassionate to angry. Why would somebody change a compassionate Jesus to an angry Jesus? That wouldn't make sense in the story. People would change an angry Jesus to a compassionate Jesus to make it make more sense. So the text critics argue it is more likely that the original was angry, because you have two readings. The second reading is more likely to be generated by somebody correcting the text. That's the lectio difficilior argument. Long arguments about this in literature. I think the most extensive, maybe not extensive, but the most well-known in the defense of angry, the way at least most contemporary scholars would articulate it, was laid out by Bart Ehrman in an article, A Leper in the Hands of an Angry Jesus. It was in a festschrift for, I forget the name of the person now. But if you search A Leper in the Hands of an Angry Jesus on Google, you can find it. Response to Ehrman, Peter J. Williams. I should have checked this. I believe his article is called An Evaluation for Ehrman's Case for Orgistheis. In fact, I will check that for you on the fly here right now. Let's... I can't find it right now. But if you look, Peter J. Williams, Mark 141. Actually, let me try that. Yeah, that's what it's called. An evaluation for Ehrman's case for Orgistheis. It's a good response to that. A positive case for splagnestheis would be Nick Perrin, an article entitled Managing Jesus' Anger. So these are the kinds of things, if you geek out over this like I do, This is something that's really interesting. This is actually an area of research for me and my brother, who's a computational linguist. We've done original work on this that's in progress for publication right now on using mathematical computer models, using spell check models. We actually built a spell checker for the New Testament, the same software that underlies, Microsoft Office or the autocorrect in your phone, to determine which one of these two readings is more likely, at least from a copying perspective. So our original work, along with my brother, using computational linguistic models, determines that compassionate is the much more likely reading by hundreds of times more likely in terms of the mechanical mistakes that could have generated one from the other. It doesn't make it a determination as to whether or not it was intentional, but at least if you can make a case that it was a copying mistake, which in this case I think there's a relatively good case that you could do that. And this is where many people would disagree, but we have a theory that we'd like to put forward regarding that. It's overwhelmingly likely that compassionate was the original reading. So just thought I'd put that out there. We're working on that paper. I don't know when it's going to come out. Okay. So anyway, we left off on the cleansing the leper in Mark 1, 40 through 45 demonstrates Jesus' priestly office. He is the one who's not only able to heal, but he's also able to make clean. So he's shown as the priest, he's shown as the temple. Let's now look at another healing in the Gospel of Mark, the healing of the demoniac. And I have to say, this is the thing I'm most excited to talk about in both of these videos here. I think this is very interesting, and it's a reading that few people are familiar with. Not the story, but this interpretation. I think it's very helpful. So we're going to read Mark 5, 1 through 20. So then they came to the other side of the sea, to the region of the Gerasenes. As soon as Jesus got out of the boat, a man with an unclean spirit came out of the tombs and met him. The man lived in the tombs. No one was able to restrain him anymore, even with chains, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains, but snapped off the chains and smashed the shackles. No one was strong enough to subdue him. And always, night and day, he was crying out among the tombs in the mountains and cutting himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and knelt down before him, and he cried out with a loud voice, "What do you have to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you before God, don't torment me." For he had told him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." "What is your name?" Jesus asked him. "My name is Legion," he answered, "because we are many." And the man kept begging Jesus not to send him out of the region. Now a large herd of pigs were there, feeding on the hillside. The demons begged Jesus, "Send us to the pigs so we may enter them." And Jesus gave them permission. Then the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs, and the herd of about 2,000 rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned there. The men who tended them ran off and reported it to the town and the countryside, and the people went to see what had happened. They came to Jesus, and they saw the man who had been demon-possessed by the legion, sitting there, dressed in his right mind, and they were afraid. The eyewitnesses described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and told them about the pigs. Then they began to beg him to leave their region. As Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed kept begging Jesus to be with him. But Jesus would not let him. Instead, Jesus told him, "Go back to your own people and report to them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." So he went out and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and they were all amazed. The word of the Lord. Okay, so that's the story of the cleansing and the demoniac. Very interesting story. There's no other story like this one in the Gospels. Maybe one story I can think of like this one in Acts. But really not, I don't know, I think this one's pretty unique. So let's set the scene. Where did they go? So they were coming from Galilee. They went across the Sea of Galilee here to the region of the Gerasenes. They run into a storm. This is in Mark chapter 4, which Jesus calms. The end of chapter 4, I'm going to read, 4:41. This is the verse prior to this story. And they were terrified, this is the disciples, and asked one another, "Who is this? Even the wind and the sea obey him." So those are the words that come immediately prior to this story. Now note the specifics of this story. So cross to the region of the Gerasenes. It's away from Galilee. In fact, if you cross the sea, you're exiting Judea. You're no longer in that region. You are in Gentile territory. And they encounter uncleanness. There's a man with an unclean spirit who approaches. They're among tombs. Tombs are unclean. Remember, Jews could not touch dead bodies, they would become unclean. They're among the pigs, which are also unclean. So they're in Gentile territory. They encounter an unclean spirit. That word is used right there. It's interesting. Eventually the word for demons is used, but not at the beginning. Here it's described as an unclean spirit. I think that's on purpose to create this comparison here. He has an unclean spirit. He's living among the tombs. Everybody in Mark's audience knows that tombs are unclean. Among the pigs, everybody in Mark's audience knows the pigs are unclean in a non-Jewish territory. The demoniac refers to Jesus as Son of the Most High. This is a Gentile term referring to the Jewish God Yahweh. This is the way that they would talk about Yahweh, Son of the Most High. Or, sorry, the Most High God. Forgive me. The Son of the Most High is different. That's referring to Jesus. The Most High God was a Gentile term for Yahweh. So here's the question I'm going to ask right here before we get further into it. Do you think Jesus might have had something more in mind when he chose to go to this place than, let's all get away from these crowds here in Galilee? It's not just a vacation. This isn't just like, oh my gosh, we're being mobbed. We got to get away. What are we going to do? Quick, let's just go across the sea. The scene seems a bit too convenient, right? What's the demoniac's name? Also, Legion, right? Remember, Mark is writing in Rome. This word would have struck them as having a very specific meaning and reference. What do you think Legion is going to mean to people in Rome? What was the term for the Roman army? It was the Legion. The Legion was like a big unit of the Roman army. Legionaries were titles of some warriors in the Roman army. The 20th Legion, actually, was based just up the road from where this encounter occurred. So you're in Gentile territory. You've encountered an unclean spirit among the tombs and among the pigs. The demoniac is using a Gentile name, the Most High, to address you. And his name is Legion. His name is the same as the name for the Roman army that's stationed right up there. This is being set up actually as a very dramatic scene because the Roman army was the instrument of Roman power. This is sort of a preview of the clash of kingdoms that's about to come. We can begin to see the outline of this story as a clash of kingdoms story. On one side, you have the hegemon of the day, Rome, the unclean, being unfit to worship Yahweh, the legion and the pigs, the symbols of Roman power. In fact, hold on. Did I describe this? Yes. We'll get to that. But the pigs were also a symbol of Roman power. We're going to get to that in a second. So you have the hegemon, Rome. You have Jesus. And they're having a face-off here. And how does this clash of kingdoms turn out? The pigs, by the way, which would most likely resemble wild boars, more so than the swine that we think of, were probably being farmed as food for the legion, not for the demoniac, the soldiers. Wild boars were a favorite symbol of the Romans because of their aggression and power. Wild boars are not nice animals. These are, they've got tusks. They're angry. We actually have coins of Caesar Augustus on one side and the image of a wild boar on the flip side. That image represented power to them, represented the kind of aggression that they liked, and to mint that on a coin was significant. Everybody was carrying around on one side Caesar Augustus and on the other side a boar. So think of it that way. The pigs are a symbol here of Caesar, almost. or at least close to it. They're a symbol of Rome in particular. So you've got the legion, you've got the pigs. These things are unclean in Gentile territory amongst the tombs, facing off against Jesus. And in fact, this was amazing to me too. The mascot of the 20th Legion that was stationed just up the street was indeed a wild boar. So now we're seeing this clash in focus. What's going on here is Jesus is living out a story that's going to tell them about what Jesus is going to do in the world. Jesus drives the spirits from the man into the pigs, and the pigs plunge into the sea. That's the way that this ends. What does this sound like when an army and the symbols, the power symbols of the enemy of God's people, are cast into the sea? Again, we've been talking about New Exodus. Last week we talked a lot about how the powers of that day were being linked with Pharaoh. Jesus is the new Moses. Now you've got the symbol of power, and that day it was Egypt, and this day it's Rome. You've got like 6 or 7 symbols that are lining up here. And the symbols of the power of the day plunge into the sea. Just as Yahweh defeated Pharaoh, so also will Yahweh defeat the powers of Jesus' day. So also will Yahweh defeat Rome. This will happen as well. They will be carried through on their new Exodus. They will have power over the unclean. So, yeah. So I didn't quite finish this here, but you're seeing, and I think this is going to be very apparent at the crucifixion as well. The clash of kingdoms narrative is very important to the Gospels. That is, Mark, the beginning of Mark's Gospel, the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And we talked about this in the New Covenant video about how this was a sort of a revolutionary statement because Caesar was the Son of God. To say that Jesus is the Son of God, if you say Jesus is Lord, if you confess with your mouth and believe with your heart that Jesus is Lord, you will be saved. Caesar is Lord, Kaiser Kurios, was a greeting in Rome, and he was the Son of God. To say Jesus is Lord, to call Jesus the Son of God, was revolutionary. It was to say not Caesar, but Jesus is Lord. And here, you're seeing Jesus reenacting, or not necessarily reenacting, but through the healing of the demoniac, showing that he will exert power over today's Pharaoh and emerge victorious over those powers. So, and what will eventually happen at his crucifixion is that he's going to let the powers do their worst to him. He's going to, be welcomed in as a king. They're going to be waving palms, the symbols of the of Israel. If you want to talk Roman coins, we'll talk about this next week. But image of Caesar on one side, and the coins in Judea actually had palms on the reverse side. He's coming in on a donkey. It's never been ridden. It's a royal donkey. He's walking up. Everybody's expecting the clash of kingdoms there to emerge victorious in Israel's favor, and that the Son of David will assume the throne. But what ends up happening? He's handed over to the Romans, and his enthronement ceremony doesn't happen in the temple. His enthronement happens on a cross. And they think they've got him, but yet he lets all of that happen to him, and then through his resurrection shows his victory over it. We're seeing the foreshadowing of this here, how Jesus is not only exerting power within Judea, his power is going to be exerted and will overthrow the powers of that day as well, and will install God's kingdom. So that's the higher level lesson here, I think, that's going on in the cleansing of the demoniac. One other thing I want to talk about, though, is given what we've learned about the demoniac representing Roman power, what does this tell us about demons generally? This term demon, daemon in the Greek, demonic possession, I think because of our art and our films, our culture, symbols, it's much more often associated with Linda Blair in The Exorcist. It's mainly thought of as a supernatural phenomenon that some body becomes possessed with a spirit or a soul or something of a demon. There's very little said about this in the New Testament. We've got this statement, but we don't know the metaphysics of it. We just know that it's happened. The Bible has additional associations with demons, though. As in this passage, the demon-possessed man also represents the Roman Empire. In others, demon possession seems to be related with epilepsy. So my question is, what about things like the Third Reich? A whole nation of people ideologically, dare we say demonically, possessed by that ideology. What about the USSR, Maoist China, Pol Pot, North Korea? These places where it seems like people have truly descended into the full-on worship of something evil and complete rejection of what is good. To think of demon possession as like the idolatry of demons, and to see what that brings into the world. I mean, it brings nothing short of hell on earth. Truly. That when these nations or these ideologies take hold of people and turn them into something that brings this sort of evil into the world. And we think about the rulers and the powers and principalities that rule over this present darkness. To paraphrase Ephesians 6, how might we interpret this passage? I think if we have this supernatural, idea, and we focus a lot on, the exorcist type demons, I think we miss a lot of demons. I think we're not necessarily seeing how these dark powers work in today's world, or work out in ideologies that are truly anti-God, that truly do grab a hold of people. For heaven's sake, if you've checked your Facebook feed recently, you can see how people can become possessed with ideology, and that they become an avatar for that ideology. Somebody once said, and I can't remember who it is, but everybody is an avatar of a dead philosopher. And we, of course, want to be avatars of Jesus. That's our idea. We wouldn't necessarily reject that. But, you can see how ideological possession can lead to, forget the consequences. We're going to realize our vision, and it doesn't matter how many bodies pile up while we do it. If we can't call that demonic because we're waiting for, somebody to, crawl up the stairs on all fours or their head to do a 360, I think we're really missing something. In this passage here, the demons are associated with power. Demons are associated with Rome. And there was a whole lot about Rome that I think we could say was demonic. And we should. And we should be on the lookout for that kind of thing. It also makes us wonder, what does exorcism look like? Right? You could look at the mission to the Gentiles and the eventual conversion of the Roman Empire as a deliverance ministry, delivering them from the powers that had possessed the Roman Empire. It is a way to look at history. It's not without some flaws, but I like the analogy. Just like, eventually bringing down the Third Reich was performing an exorcism. And, there's people who still lived through that, who remember waking up during that period of time, after the slumber of Hitler's rule. It's pretty incredible to look at those parallels. Okay, we've got more animation issues, but we've got one more healing to talk about. This would be the healing of the paralytic in John chapter 5. So we're going to read that. Turning here to John 5. Okay. Verse 1, after this, a Jewish festival took place, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. By the sheep gate in Jerusalem, there's a pool called Bethsaida in Hebrew, which has 5 colonnades. Within these lay a large number of the sick, blind, lame, and paralyzed, waiting for the moving of the water, because an angel would go down into the pool from time to time and stir up the water. Then the first one who got in after the water was stirred up had recovered from whatever ailment he had. This segment of the text is bracketed, starting with waiting from moving to the water down to where I just read. The note on that is other manuscripts omit that bracketed text. It's quite possible that that was a later insertion, an explanatory insertion. One man was there who had been sick for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew he had already been there a long time, Jesus asked the man, "Do you want to get well?" "Sir," the sick man answered, "I don't have a man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. But when I'm coming, someone goes down ahead of me." "Get up," Jesus told him, "pick up your mat and walk." Instantly the man got well, picked up his mat, and started to walk. Now that day was the Sabbath, so the Jews had said to the man who had been healed, "This is the Sabbath, it is illegal for you to pick up your mat." The man replied, "The man who made me well told me, 'Pick up your mat and walk.'" "Who is this man who told you, 'Pick up your mat and walk'?" they asked. But the man who was cured did not know who it was, because Jesus had slipped away into the crowd that was there. After this, Jesus found him in the temple complex and said to him, "See, you are well. Do not sin anymore so that something worse doesn't happen to you." The man went and reported to the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. Okay, so let's look at the setting here. So there's an unnamed festival going on. There's a good argument that this festival is Rosh Hashanah. We don't need to go into those particular arguments because it's not important for the story here, but the pool, so Bethsaida, that's the name of the pool. Now there's 5 colonnades by the sheep gate. What's interesting here is there are a lot of interpretations, and I think there's a good reason for this that we'll get into, but a common interpretation of this story goes this way. Man has been paralyzed for 38 years within the confines of the 5 colonnades, which represent the Torah. You have 5 colonnades, you have 5 books of Moses. There's a man who's paralyzed there. In fact, Deuteronomy 2:14 states that Israel's wandering was for 38 years. So a man's been paralyzed within the Torah for 38 years. Jesus heals the man so he can leave the Torah behind, no longer paralyzed. After all, Jesus identifies himself as the door for the sheep in 10:1, and so these 5 colonnades are there by the sheep gate, and there's the door for the sheep. Well, Jesus is identified as the door, and he can be the one to let the paralyzed man out from the confines of the Torah, who's representing Israel, obviously through the 38-year paralysis. So especially given the Deuteronomy 2 reference, I think this is probably a legit interpretation of the story. I think that is an accurate way to look at this. It's possible, though, that this could simply represent the fact that John is faithfully recording the setting of this healing miracle. Archaeologically, for instance, we've discovered this pool. There are 5 gates, the porticos, colonnades. People had said for a while, well, because of these references to Torah and the wandering and the sheep gate and Jesus, I am the gate, and all of that, this is a made-up story. It's clearly there to be symbolic, to describe something about Jesus. Of course, as everything is symbolic, then there's no, Jesus isn't a thing for there to be a symbol of either. But we've discovered a pool where they said it should be, and that pool has 5 gates, and they're by the sheep gate. So it's possible that this is just a faithful recording of that. But I also don't think things happen on accident. I think there's a reason that God set up these situations the way that he did. So here's the really interesting question. Do you want to be made well? What kind of question is that? Of course he wants to be made well, right? Right? Who wouldn't want to be made well? 38 years paralyzed? This is a pretty miserable existence. Don't you want to get up? Okay, imagine this, though. If you've been paralyzed for 38 years, how's he getting fed? How's he getting bathed? Getting help for any other conditions that he has? You're not going to survive. Paralyzed for 38 years. Just sitting there on the ground. Somebody's going to have to help you. Somebody's going to have to help you to the bathroom. You're going to have a good amount of help coming to you regularly if you're going to survive 38 years paralyzed. So it is reasonable to infer here this man may actually not want to get well. He doesn't even answer the question, actually. When Jesus asks him, do you want to be made well? What's his response? It's an excuse. And so, he says, sir, I don't have a man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. While I'm coming, someone goes ahead of me. So it's like, do you want to be made well? Well, I mean, somebody always gets in the water before me. I can never make it. I don't know. The story doesn't say he does not want to be made well. But I think there's a good inference here that the guy is at least not trying as hard as he could. Imagine if he leveraged his whole network here to say, all right, you guys who are feeding me and bathing me, let's come up with a plan to get me in that pool. Then, that'll work. To think that everybody else for 38 years was able to figure this out, and he still hadn't, don't know. So, and I think that's important. The ambiguity here is important to the setting, because Jesus then just heals them without his permission, consent, or stated desire to be healed. One might call it irresistible grace. Dog whistle free 5-pointers out there. So the interesting thing here is he doesn't say, like the leper in Mark 1, if you wish, you can make me clean. Jesus approaches the man, says, do you want to be made well? The man gives a non-responsive answer. Jesus just heals him. You can imagine Jesus being like, oh boy, all right, get up. Jesus told him, pick up your mat and walk. So the man gets up, takes up his mat, and walks as Jesus commanded him. So what's scandalous about Jesus' direction? Well, we read it, right? Now that day was the Sabbath, so the Jews said to the man who had been healed, it is the Sabbath, it is not lawful for you to take up your bed. So, but the man who healed me said, take up your mat and walk. Now, there was a whole cottage industry of what was and wasn't permitted on the Sabbath, and they felt like they were trying to figure this out because they were definitely sure that the reason the Messiah had not come back was because they weren't observing the Sabbath properly, because they purged the idolatry. That was true. They did a very good job of that. So obviously, it's, renegade people on the Sabbath, and this guy right here just, ruined the Sabbath for all of Israel by taking up his mat. And his response, the man who healed me said, take up your mat and walk. Where's the gratitude here? That's interesting. In fact, this whole thing is a textbook example of missing the forest through the trees. A paralyzed man of 38 years is miraculously healed, but the concern is about mat carrying on the Sabbath. The Jews who see him are missing the healing. They're missing the redemption. They're missing the massive miracle that just took place because they're concerned about the Sabbath. I think this is also something that commends the interpretation of the 5 colonnades representing the Torah, and then somebody's miraculously healed, and they're still concerned about the Torah. They're focused on that. But the man does the same thing. The man's not like the leper in Mark 1, who can't stop telling people about Jesus. He's like, oh no, the man who healed me told me to do that. And so there's no gratitude, but there's this hyper-focus on both sides about the mat carrying. This emphasizes just how critical Sabbath observance was thought to be in Jesus' day. So when we think about our initial analogy, this man represents wandering Israel, 38 years. And remember what the wandering accomplished. Remember, there were 2 censuses, Numbers 1 and Numbers 26. Numbers 26, after the second census, reads, but among them there was not one who had been registered by Moses and Aaron the priest when they registered the Israelites in the wilderness at Sinai. That's Numbers 1. For the Lord had said to them that they would all die in the wilderness. None of them was left except Caleb and Joshua. And why? Because of their unwillingness to trust God. This was brought upon them. The spies at Kadesh Barnea, when they went and spied out the land, they came back and said, those guys are big and strong, we're not going in there, even though Yahweh told us to. Thus begins the wandering. And Yahweh's punishment was that none of those people who were part of that generation would enter the land. And that's what you end up seeing at the end of the second census. So Jesus, in this healing miracle, shows how he wants to unilaterally rescue Israel. I think that's the point that's going on here. The man's excuses resonate so well as the analogs to the stubbornness of the Israelites. Think of judges, they're always crying out for help, but they never actually commit to a long-term solution. It's like, oh, I can just never really, I can't ever get in the water. Somebody always gets in there before me. The Israelites, the same sort of thing, are always whining about one thing or the other. They're missing the point of the redemption. Just like the man is making excuses. They turn their back on Yahweh when the going gets tough. It's like the man when he had to face the Jews who accused him of Sabbath breaking. He's like, the man who healed me told me to take up my mat and walk. I'm not responsible. Very much like how the Israelites are turning their back on Yahweh, but nonetheless, Jesus is going to bring the new covenant. He's going to leave the 5 old colonnades behind, the Torah. He'll take that stubborn, crippled, lame person or people who don't want to help themselves and heal them. So here, I think we get an illustration of how God is going to unilaterally, through Jesus, bring his people through, whether they're up to it or not, and whether they're focused on the right things or not. And I think we also see here with the focus on the Sabbath that there are some people who are still going to miss the point after the fact. After the redemption has taken place, you're still going to have people who focus on the wrong things and who are focused, whether it's on legalism, whether it's on an old religion, whether it's just missing the forest through the trees generally, that they're not going to see the glory of the redemption that God has brought. But nonetheless, God is going to do it, regardless of whatever excuse you might have. So to summarize, Jesus' teaching and healing ministry was about announcing how the new covenant was going to